Welcome to Office Hours, brought to you by the Mortara Center for International Studies. My name is Alexandra Hamilton, and today we're doing a special pilot episode with my colleague Ryan Weierman, a fellow 2026 Pelosi Scholar. She's here to talk about what it's really like to do research and publish academic history as an undergraduate. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me, Alex. I'm really excited to be here today.
So, Ryan, could you tell us a little bit about your experience publishing in the Georgetown Journal of History?
Sure, yeah. Just for background, I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. I'm majoring in international politics, and I'm pursuing a minor in French and Francophone Studies and a certificate in African Studies. And as a student in the SFS, you're required to take several history courses for the core requirement. So my freshman spring, I took a history course called Gender and Sexuality in MENA, Middle East, North Africa. And there was a final paper for this course that was a long semester project. And at the end of the semester, my professor said, "Hey, did you know you could submit this to an undergraduate academic journal? And I recommend that you try to publish this piece." So I ended up publishing the piece, and we'll be talking about that process more in depth today.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about how you picked a topic and how you went about researching? Because I'm sure for a lot of undergraduates, it may seem kind of daunting to just tackle a topic that could be so broad, and there's so much already out there related to that subject.
Exactly. So my finished product compares two women, one from Martinique, a overseas department of France, but a former French colony, and Algeria, and how these two women resisted the French colonial structure following World War II and Vichy rule in France. And I started off the research process by originally focusing on Algeria. I was interested in women's suffrage, how it developed over time, and how citizenship policies were constructed in Algeria based on a very gendered and religious criteria. And then I submitted an original topic proposal to my professor, and she said, "Hey, this is great. You've done so much research, but you're not contributing any new ideas to the field." So I had to go back to the drawing board and submit a revised topic proposal. And this was really daunting, and it made me think about how can I, as an undergrad in my first history class, add something to the field, and how do I come up with a new idea as opposed to just producing something that's already existing in the literature review.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's a difficult topic for any undergrad because originality is something hard to come by. So what were you looking at? What sources, what ideas were you looking for specifically to help inform how you were going to change the perspective on your topic?
Yeah, so I was stressed out for a while. I won't lie, because this project was really important to me. I wanted to do a good job on my first research article. And then I decided to sort of take a step back and think about my research interests in Francophone studies and how it wasn't just in North Africa that was part of the French Empire, but how could I compare my ideas to histories and lessons I'd learned in other classes. And at the same time, I was enrolled in an African Studies elective called Afro-Paris, Art, Identity, and Resistance. And I had learned about the French overseas departments and former colonies in the Caribbean, in the Antilles. And I decided, I could contribute something original to this literature by creating a cross-regional or cross-continental comparison of how women in Martinique and Algeria protested citizenship laws and unfair suffrage policies and really advocated for their own forms of civic engagement against the French colonial structure. So by creating this interdisciplinary, cross-cultural comparison, I was able to contribute a new idea to the literature because no one yet had done a Martinique times Algeria comparison before.
That's very interesting, and I like the point about comparing to things that you may be familiar with instead of trying to have to really go deep into one specific topic and try to be original, especially if the field is very well studied already. I also wanted to ask you about the actual research process once you had kind of decided the new way you wanted to take your piece, how did you decide where to look for sources? What sources were useful? Were there any particular challenges you found with accessing certain pieces of information that someone else who's interested in research might run into?
I think the best piece of advice I could give is to consult with librarians, research librarians at Lowinger. Shout out Lau. We are currently in the podcast studio at Lau. It's our favorite place to be, in the basement of Lau 1. I had gone on the library website and looked at different databases for African studies and also French and Francophone studies, and I was able to access different archival sources through the links on these websites, which were really fantastic. And the majority of my research was from primary source documents that were French citizenship laws. So really going back into the French legal code and legal history and different legal publications, which meant that the majority of my research was in French, which then meant I got to employ some of my language skills for the research process, which was a fun challenge. And then because it was in a normal history class taught in English, then I had to use some translation services to be able to make it accessible for my readers.
Right, and I'm sure that must have been something that maybe you didn't realize going into the process. I also want to ask you about other challenges you faced, specifically once you had a general idea and a rough draft of the piece. Kind of, how did you go about editing the actual journal piece? And then from there, what was your interaction like with people at the journal specifically? Was there kind of discussions about ways you should take the piece? Were there edits maybe you didn't agree with? Or kind of how did that dynamic play out?
Yeah, so after submitting the paper in my class, then it was summer. I came back to campus in August, and I was at the student activities fair, and I saw the table for the Journal of History, which I had never seen before, never heard of. So I went up to them, talked to them. They recommended submitting the piece, so I just put it into them. About a week later, I got the publication offer, which I was very excited about. And I was a little nervous going into this process because I didn't know if they were going to try to change the thesis of the piece or change anything substantial in terms of the argument. But it ended up being a wonderful process. They let me be, I guess, the final say, or they let me have the final say on almost every part of the editing process, and it was more looking at readability and improving instances of grammar as opposed to changing my argument, which I really appreciated. And then there were some moments where I did get pushback on certain terms or concepts, but I was able to explain it to them and really just show that I had the knowledge of the situation or the context and that the language I was using was appropriate for the piece.
Right, and I'm curious what you kind of learned about not just your writing style, but history and research in general from that whole process, looking back at where you started with the topic and where the piece actually ended up. Kind of, what did that process show you, both in terms of your own writing and just the long-term nature of research more generally?
Yeah, I think this process showed to me that you can't pull an all-nighter in Lao and write your final history project in however many hours you'd spend here overnight. This was truly a semester-long project, and my ideas were constantly changing. I was constantly finding new sources that sort of revolutionized my research. For example, I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is at first I was working with sources written by Martinican women because they had more access to publishing, and just in terms of literacy, the literacy rates were higher than Algerian women at the time. I would say the biggest struggle of my research process was that there was a wide array of primary sources written by Martinican women from the time period, post-World War II and following Vichy rule, but there weren't many published sources at all for Algerian women, just considering the limitations of literacy at the time for Algerian women, but also just the fact that it was in a war for independence, so there weren't as many opportunities. So when I was trying to find primary sources to highlight the voices of Paulette Nardel, the Black Antillean woman from Martinique, and then Zora Dreef, the Muslim Algerian woman who was in the National Liberation Front, I had to use primary sources from different time periods and then sort of discuss the limitations of what does it mean to use primary source from a Martinican woman writing in the 1940s and 1950s, and then comparing that to a 2017 memoir of the Algerian War. So the fact that I had to acknowledge why did this time gap exist, and why is it still useful for me to use the primary source information from a memoir as opposed to writing during the time period.
Right, and I'm sure time period differences do cause a bit of challenge in terms of creating a succinct argument. I was wondering if you could talk about just more generally what you learned in terms of analysis and writing style that you maybe wouldn't learn just from a history class paper, because this does seem to be a little more fleshed out. Kind of what was that difference like, and do you feel like you gained a different perspective on writing because this is a journal piece, not just a class assignment?
Yes, yeah, I would say that as opposed to traditional history analysis, I had to develop skills in literary analysis because both of the women I was researching employed a very stylistic approach to writing. So Nardel, on the one hand, used a lot of creative terminology, and she used a lot of prose to describe the situation going on in Martinique and advocating for social justice issues in a more, I would say, delicate and very, very literary, almost poetic writing style. And then on the other hand, we had Dreef, and in Dreef's memoir, she was recounting events as opposed to writing immediately for women as an audience at the time in the post-war era, or I guess for her it was the Algerian War.
Pivoting a bit away from the actual research process and more towards the topic more generally, how did you get interested in Africa and Africa studies, especially as someone who maybe did not have a direct connection to the region or a lot of knowledge before coming to Georgetown?
Yes, so I got interested in African studies after my freshman pro seminar taught by Dr. Laura Smith, and she's the director of the African Studies program, and I took her course called Migration in and from Africa. And through her course, I realized how important it is to explore the connection between Francophone studies and African studies, recognizing that over 60% of the world's French speakers live in Africa, and this proportion is only continuing to grow due to rapid population rise in West Africa. So I figured it's a responsibility to study French not as merely a European language taught in Western Europe or even just in the Hexagon, which is mainland France, but to explore it beyond its colonial history as well.
You mentioned that you got very inspired by this class that you took at Georgetown. What would you say to someone who is maybe interested in certain topics or regions, but is kind of just getting their feet wet and isn't really sure if they should delve into a topic or if that specific theme is right for them?
I would say take as many regionally focused classes as you can and just gain any type of skills and knowledge of specific histories and ideas, and try to use your language skills as much as possible in your non-language classes because it really builds a sort of cultural literacy. I was very excited my freshman spring to take the Afro-Paris African Studies elective, and I have absolutely no regrets. I would say that's my favorite course I've ever taken at Georgetown, and some of the histories that I learned from that class and some of the ideas and authors I've been employing in the rest of my African Studies classes so far. So just don't be afraid to take a class that you think is, oh, this might not be that productive working toward my core requirements. Still take the class because chances are you're going to love it, and then you're going to be able to use those ideas in all of your classes. For example, Paulette Nardell, the Martinican woman I learned about in Afro-Paris, ended up being one of the stars of my history paper, and I wouldn't have been able to create this comparison between Martinique and Algeria if it hadn't been for that course.
Right, for sure. And I just personally want to echo that statement because I'm a regional and comparative studies major at Georgetown, and I think people have the misperception that if you only focus on one region, then you know so much about just one thing and you don't really know a lot about the world more generally. But there is so much to be said about cross-applying different case studies or translating different stories and histories among different regions as well. So I think just those skills that you were talking about before, comparison, translation, can really apply to other places as well, and is very important more generally. Kind of shifting gears here and continuing on this theme of exploring regional perspectives. I heard you're going to Ghana for a class.
Yes, in about a week, I will be traveling to Accra, Ghana with the African Studies Department, and this is connected to an SFS Centennial Lab course called Africa is People. So it's a 3-credit course attached to a 1-credit trip over spring break, which is subsidized by the SFS. Very grateful for that. And we will be exploring sort of the post-colonial history of Ghana, going to independence sites, but also engaging with histories and memorials for the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism.
That's very exciting. I'm very jealous of that really amazing opportunity. Okay, so just wrapping up, let's do some rapid fire undergrad questions.
I'm obsessed.
What has been your favorite Georgetown experience so far?
Oh my gosh. Oh, I was just staffing a Model UN conference over the weekend with some high schoolers, and they asked me that same question. And I'm going to kind of cheat and be like, I hope my favorite experience becomes traveling to Ghana. So it hasn't happened yet, but I'm manifesting that will become my favorite memory. But I think so far, my favorite Georgetown memory has just been anytime I'm with my friends off campus and we're going to museums or going to different restaurants in DC, even though it can be sort of mundane or like a normal routine, anytime I can get off campus is the best time.
Nice. And last question, since this is a Mortara Center podcast, what is your favorite part about the Mortara Center?
I would say my favorite part about the Mortara Center is there's never a dull moment. It's always busy. There are always so many interesting academic events and diplomats visiting, or like I said, different academics visiting. There's always so many amazing people coming in and out, and I get to have a lot of FaceTime with them by just sitting at the desk, helping people out. And also shout out Pauline. She's the nicest, awesomest boss ever.
Yes, well, thank you so much for joining us on this pilot episode of our podcast. Be sure to check out Mortara Center on Instagram and at our website, and I hope this was useful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Office Hours' mission is to make international relations more accessible by connecting students to professors who are conducting research on the world's most pressing international affairs topics. Everything we publish is freely available without ads or a paywall. All Office Hours content is under Creative Commons license and can be copied and redistributed, as long as the work is attributed to us and any changes are noted. We would like to thank the Mortara Center for International Studies and Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service for their support.